Sorry, what was that, Akazuki? Oh, do you have something to say? See, I'm supposed to be saying, howdy folks, hope we've all had a good weekend and welcome to an episode of Mingles with Jingles, but Akazuki appears to want to take over. What do you think? Sunday was a really dull day for me. Because I'm a silly old bugger, I took a nap in the afternoon and I woke up surrounded by animals. So I put the phone to use and started taking pictures of them, which went up all over social media. Actually, I tend to take naps most afternoons, not just on Sundays. Mostly because Akazuki has this very annoying habit of waking me up anytime between 6 and 7 a.m. demanding to be fed. So my routine most mornings is to get dragged out of bed by an extremely loud and insistent cat, feed her, put water down for the rest of the pets, stagger to my PC, publish whatever the video of the day is, do the social media thing, and then pretend I'm awake for a couple of hours until I eventually just give up and stop pretending and go back to bed for a few hours in the afternoon. Nice work if you can get it, I suppose. Oh, I just realised, because it's inevitably going to attract comments, which is understandable. When I say I get up, feed Akazuki, put water down for the other pets, and then stagger to the PC, the other pets are all automatic, timed feeders. Akazuki isn't, because she's on a different diet to the others. In fact, we had to get a microchipped, covered pet feeder specifically for Akazuki, because we give her a mix of wet food and dry food. And, you know, she's not a greedy cat. She'll eat if she's hungry, but she always just nibbles at the food. She doesn't eat a whole lot in one go. And it rapidly became apparent that the second Akazuki wandered away from her food bowl, Juicy and Crystalline were all over it, and even Boo if he could get the chance. So we had to come up with a way of ensuring that only Akazuki got to eat Akazuki's food. So I got a hold of a pet feeder that's got a retractable cover and an arch, and when a pet puts their neck through the arch to try to get at the food, it reads the microchip embedded in them, and it will only open for Akazuki. So, great piece of kit. Solved all kinds of problems. Don't worry, I'm not going to be going on about the pets all day. I'm just, well, I'm kind of stalling for time because I really have absolutely no idea what I'm going to talk about today. It's just been that kind of week. Those of you who were paying attention, or who care, might have noticed that there was a new Old Man Jingles video went up. Old Man Jingles? Actually, no, I've changed the name, because there was a much better suggestion. Home with the Gnome, my other YouTube channel, where I mostly cook stuff. In this video, I'll put a link in the video description, I cooked the most expensive meal I have ever done. It was a grade A5 Kagoshima wagyu steak. Holy shit. I can see why it was so expensive. I didn't say how much it cost. £93 sterling, or about $130. Suffice to say, I'm not going to be eating one of these every week, or even every month, or even every year. But I've heard so much about them, and after a bit of investigation into how the cattle are reared, they actually they give the cows massages. I don't think this thing was worth $130, but I could see why it was so expensive. I have never tasted anything quite like it. The thing that makes Wagyu so different to any other steak you've ever had is the way the fat content is distributed throughout the meat. Normally, when you get a steak, the fat is mostly around the outside, just under the skin. But in a Wagyu steak, the fat, they call it marbling, because if you look at the steak, it looks like red marble, because the fat is just distributed all throughout the meat. What that means is when you cook it, it is unbelievably juicy and tender. I mean, it's like steak butter. I have never tasted anything quite like it. Still don't think it was worth $130, but I'm glad that I've at least experienced it. It absolutely was delicious. Of course, I cooked it medium, which attracted some inevitable amount of shit in the comments from people saying, oh my god, how could you overcook and ruin a great steak like that? Here's the thing. Because the fat is all the way throughout the meat, you kind of have to cook it medium. Not well done, that would ruin it, but you kind of have to at least cook it medium, because otherwise you're not going to render down the fat distributed all the way through the meat. You're basically going to be eating raw fat. So, you know, see it on the outside, pink in the middle is fine. I mean, you know, if you like a rare wagyu steak, then by all means cook your wagyu rare, but no. No, sorry. Right, anyway, enough stalling. What are we going to talk about this week? Well, I suppose in World of Warships there's the news that Deadeye is no more, and not before time. For those of you who don't play World of Warships, quick explanation. The recent Commander skill rework, which I think it's safe to say was not a huge success, so much so that it is being reworked. Yes, they're reworking the rework. The principal culprit was the Deadeye skill for battleships, which meant that battleships were 10% more accurate as long as there were no enemy visible ships within the battleship surface detection range, which basically just encouraged, as if they actually needed further encouragement, battleship players to sit at the back of the map, sniping at long range. Now, while I'm sure there are people out there who thought that Deadeye was a good skill, the general consensus of opinion seems to be that it was basically ruining the game for everybody. And so Wargaming have decided that Deadeye is getting the chop, and it's being replaced with a new skill called Swift in Silence. And what this skill does is, providing your battleship is not spotted, it's 10% faster. And I think this is a good idea, because it means that on those occasions when you really have bitten off more than you can chew and you need to relocate fast, providing you can go undetected, you'll be able to relocate 10% faster. So that's good. I'm just not sure it's worth 4 skill points, but if it means we're seeing the back of the Deadeye skill, I'll take it. Deadeye's not the only skill that gets addressed. For example, cruisers are receiving a better version of the survivability expert skill to give them more health. There's a whole bunch of changes, none of which address the nerfing of battleship secondary skills, which aren't being touched in the rework of the rework. And Wargaming have announced that they're not going to be messing around with the skills again for at least 6 months. So battleship secondary builds are going to remain just as terrible as they have been since the Commander skill rework for a minimum of 6 further months. Ah well. In other news, I read today that Microsoft Edge is the fastest growing browser. Wow. I think it's probably safe to say that most people's experience of Microsoft Edge is because it's the browser that comes bundled with a new version of Windows. Most people use it for about as long as it takes to download a version of Chrome. Despite that, it turns out that, well, depending on whose statistics you believe, Microsoft Edge is now a more popular browser than Firefox. My, how the mighty have fallen. And it is now second only in popularity to Google Chrome. It's a very distant second, though. It's a bit like during the first Gulf War, when they kept on going on about what a massive army Iraq had. You know, it's like they were stealing us for disappointment in advance of the ground troops going in. Like, yeah, we're doing well, but let us not forget that Iraq has the 4th largest army in the world. Yeah, but there's a real big drop-off after the first 2. Okay. You've got like the USA, the USSR, and the 3rd biggest army in the world are the Hare Krishnas. And to quote Bill Hicks, they control all of the airports. So yeah, Edge may now be more popular than Firefox, but it still only has 8% of the market. Now that's still a 1300% increase over the 0.57% of the market that Edge had this time last year, but it's not even close to challenging Chrome. Google Chrome's popularity has dropped over the last year. I mean, I still use it. Most people do, because it currently enjoys a 67.14% market share, but that is down 3% over the 70.33% that enjoyed this time last year. At the same time, I really don't think Google need to be worried about Microsoft Edge. Not immediately, at least. It was very surprising to hear that Firefox has dropped in popularity as much as it has. Because I used Firefox for years before switching to Chrome. Does anybody out there still use Firefox? Are you happy with it? I mean, I switched from Firefox to Chrome so long ago I can't even remember why, but if any of you out there have recently switched from Firefox to Chrome, or even to Microsoft Edge, why did you do it? In other news, Twitch have just updated their terms of service to allow them to kick you off the platform and ban you for offences that have absolutely nothing to do with Twitch. And we're mostly talking about, you know, actual serious crimes here that are committed off the platform. This probably isn't really that surprising. This probably shouldn't really be that surprising. Twitch certainly aren't the only company who reserve the right to fire their employees for getting into trouble with the law. I think the only real surprising thing about it is that it's taken this long to happen. I do think it's a little ironic, though, that this is one of the few occasions where Twitch will actually give somebody a reason for getting rid of them. If you commit an offence on Twitch, they'll get rid of you without telling you what it was. And that's something that's always been really confusing to me about Twitch, because there never seems to be any kind of consistency or transparency when bannable offences occur. Whenever Twitch suspends or bans somebody, they always just say it was for breaching community guidelines. They never specify exactly which community guideline you breached. And it can be really difficult to work out exactly what it is somebody's done wrong when you see people, for example, live on stream, feeding alcohol to their pets, violently abusing their pets, and bragging openly about how they married somebody purely to get a green card, and then divorced them the second the green card came through, and Twitch is perfectly fine with all of this. And then they ban Dr. Disrespect for what, as far as anybody can tell, is absolutely nothing, because no reason whatsoever was given. I suppose we should look on the bright side. At least now if you get hauled off to court for a serious crime, and Twitch bans you as a result, you'll know exactly why it happened. So hey, silver lining and all that. In other news, I learned this weekend that the Epic Games Store, which, let me remind you, has been operating since the 4th of December 2018, has not yet made a profit. In fact, it's running at a loss of about $400 million. And Epic is absolutely fine with that. In fact, doesn't expect to start turning a profit until 2023. These figures came out as a result of the, by now fairly infamous, and ongoing Epic versus Apple lawsuit. This news from PC Gamer. To take on Steam, Epic Games has spent the past 2 years shoveling Fortnite money into the Epic Games Store, making over 100 exclusivity deals and giving away free games every week. We knew Epic was spending a lot of cash to get customers onto its store, but we didn't have many specifics until now. Thanks to Epic's big legal fight with Apple, we learned this week that Epic committed around $444 million to the Epic Games Store exclusivity deals in 2020 alone. So that's $444 million on minimum guarantees for games that release on the Epic Games Store, but stay off Steam for a year. A minimum guarantee is just another way to refer to an advance. It means that Epic guarantees the publisher a certain amount of money, whether or not their game actually sells enough to cover it. For example, Epic put down $10.45 million to get the exclusive deal to sell Control on the Epic Games Store for its first year. In its end-of-year report, Epic said that players had spent $700 million on the Epic Store in 2020, but third-party game sales only accounted for $265 million of that spending. That $444 million in advances to third-party developers isn't even close to being recovered. Apple insists that the Epic Games Store isn't going to start being profitable for Epic until the year 2027. Epic disagrees, and while they quite cheerfully admit that the Epic Games Store is several $100 million in the red, what Apple calls losing money, Epic calls investing money. Epic only takes 12% of the profits of anything sold on the Epic Games Store, substantially less than the 30% that's claimed by Apple or Google on their respective stores. Epic CEO Tim Sweeney said that the Game Store is not yet profitable at its current scale and stage of development because it has front-loaded its marketing and user acquisition costs to gain market share. All of which is CEO speak for, yes, we're losing money. We've been losing money for 3 years, and we've been ploughing all of the profits from Fortnite into the Epic Game Store, and we'll have to continue doing that probably for at least another 2 years until the store itself starts turning a profit. But we don't care, because that's the price that you have to pay to compete against Steam. And by 2023, we'll have eaten into enough of Steam's market share that the store will start to show a profit on its own. And I suppose when you put it like that, it does actually make a lot of sense. Very expensive sense, but sense nonetheless. That, unfortunately, is the price of competing against Steam, I suppose. Although I'd be interested to see what exactly happens to the currently very, very generous deals that third-party developers get on the Epic Game Store when the store starts turning a profit, and the Epic Game Store no longer has to offer quite such generous terms because they've got enough market share that they no longer need to. I guess time will tell. So, in other news, the ongoing shortage of graphics cards, not helped by the fact that Nvidia are now dedicating silicon to cards that can't be used to display graphics, but instead are aimed at the Bitcoin mining market. It turns out that now, smuggling graphics cards is actually a thing. Yep, GPUs are now such a profitable commodity that criminal gangs in Hong Kong are willing to risk running afoul of the law just to smuggle unlabeled GPUs. 300 Nvidia graphics cards, specifically for GPU mining, have been seized during a raid just outside of Hong Kong International Airport. This, again, from PC Gamer. However much we might complain about the use of GPUs in large-scale mining operations, it's not illegal for those outfits to buy up a block of 300 new graphics cards for the privilege. But it is incredibly expensive. The Nvidia CMP cards, which these unmarked cards seem to be, don't have a listed retail price, but there are reports of these cards hitting the market for over $720. So with a nominal Ethereum hash rate that puts these cards at the same level as a GTX 1660 Super, once a $230 graphics card, that's one hell of a markup. With a street price of around about $217,000 for the 300 cards that were seized, you can understand why some enterprising criminals would happily help you cut out the middleman for a more reasonable price, and why that might be attractive to some serious cryptocurrency miners looking to turn a quick profit. The GPUs weren't the only things that the Hong Kong police seized in the raid though. As well as the usual suspects, smartphones, shark fins, they also found a sizable stash of system RAM. Apparently that's now so hard to get that it's actually worth smuggling too. What a time to be alive. Well anyway, as a reward for anybody who's stuck with the video for this long, I wanted to finish off this week's episode of Mingles with Jingles with a bit of World War II history for you. This from the book that I'm currently reading, James Holland's Fortress Malta, the story of the island of Malta and the siege that it endured during World War II. And in particular, I want to talk about one person who's mentioned in the book. You sitting comfortably? Then I'll begin. Early in the morning of 6th of September 1940, just a year after Britain had declared war on Germany, 3 American-built twin-engine Glen Martin Marylands touched down at Lucca Airfield after a 7-hour flight from southern England. Their crews had decided to risk flying at night over enemy-occupied France, and as a result had managed to photograph the uncharted island of Sardinia as they swept over at first light. By doing this, they proved their worth to Admiral Cunningham before even reaching Malta. Responsible for successfully plotting this route was a tall, fair-haired young man named Adrian Warburton. Taking into account potential enemy opposition, airfields en route, and weather conditions, the plan had left nothing to chance. It was just about the first thing the young pilot officer had managed to get right during his short, and so far disastrous career. When Adrian was just 2, his father had been posted to Australia. Like so many children in the services, Adrian and his older sister Alison were sent to boarding school in England, spending their holidays with their grandparents. Adrian was something of a loner as a child, and when he arrived at St Edward's School, Oxford, was immediately singled out as a misfit. He refused to play any team sports, despite an athletic build and obvious talent, and relentlessly boasted about being a voracious masturbator. I'm not making this up, right?
What the hell are you going on about?
It's Fortress Malta, the book by James Holland. He's talking about an RAF pilot whose principal talent while at boarding school was wanking.
Okay, I was just concerned if this was a biography or something.
Okay, yes. Relentlessly boasted about being a voracious masturbator, presumably hoping to shock his fellow pupils. His only interest as a child, apart from wanking... Sorry, I'm going to need a minute. This is a serious history book, by the way. His, his only interest as a child, apart from masturbating, was aviation. St Edward's was to produce two of the most famous British airmen of the war, Douglas Bader and the Dam Buster, Guy Gibson, but few people there would have reckoned on Adrian ever forging an illustrious career for himself. Although he'd always wanted to join the Royal Air Force, his parents were opposed to the idea, and it wasn't until he was 20 in 1938 that he finally went against their wishes and joined anyway. Granted a short service commission, he finally won his coveted wings with a below average rating, the lowest pass rate possible. Throughout his training he was always close to being thrown out, but he was eventually sent to join 22 Squadron Coastal Command at Gosport in Hampshire, that's where I live. Hardly the most prestigious of postings in the summer of 1939. Whether or not he'd arrived there with a warning note in his personnel file isn't clear, but he certainly wasn't allowed much flying, and before long was packed off on a course. By January 1940, he had just over half an hour's flying time to his name since joining the squadron. Between then and May, he didn't fly again, and then he was sent on another course, the classic fate of squadron members who don't fit in. When he did return to flying, it was only in an obsolete Audax biplane, drogue towing, an exercise to give air gunners air-to-air practice. In other words, the dud job. Clearly still as much of a misfit as he'd ever been as a child, Adrian had also managed to get himself into trouble. While at Gosport, he'd become a regular visitor to a pub called The Bush, where there was an attractive and popular barmaid called Betty. Although she was some years older and had a daughter from a previous relationship, the two began seeing one another. Then, acting on a whim, they married in secret in October 1939. Nuptial bliss was not forthcoming. 22 Squadron were soon after posted to Thorney Island, and although not a million miles away, Adrian chose to spend most of his time there rather than in the small bungalow he'd rented in Gosport. Since his family were totally unaware of his marriage, he could hardly ask them for financial assistance, but his pay of 10 shillings a day wasn't enough to cover the rent and keep a wife and stepdaughter. The debts began to mount, and it wasn't long before Betty decided to sue for divorce from her absentee husband. By the following summer, Adrian was in difficulties and in danger of being kicked out of the Royal Air Force. Debt of any kind was severely frowned upon, but a junior officer writing cheques that he was unable to honour was even worse. Furthermore, from June to September he was on yet another course, this time a navigational one in Blackpool. With the Battle of Britain raging, there can have been no trained pilot who had flown less than Adrian Warburton. He was extremely fortunate that on his return from Blackpool, his commanding officer at 22 Squadron decided to give him another chance. The squadron had been given 3 Marylands and told to take them to Malta under the command of an Australian flight commander named Titch Whiteley. Planning the route with a ticket to escape England was the break that Adrian had needed. Although officially still a fully trained pilot, Adrian had flown to Malta as a navigator and photographic officer, and it was in this role that he continued to be used by Whiteley during their first weeks on the island. Admiral Cunningham, with his precious reconnaissance planes finally at his service, wasted no time in instructing them to photograph the Italian fleet and ports, and specifically the naval base of Taranto, in the heel of Italy. Whiteley, a skilled engineer as well as pilot, was also a natural leader, able to spot and nurture the best in people. Somehow he detected that in Warby, as Adrian had become known, lay a potential that had been shrouded by a lack of confidence and his eccentricities of behaviour. After arranging for part of Warby's pay to be sent home every month to pay off his debts, he then appointed his junior officer as official ship recognition expert. Once again, Warby responded well to the responsibility, assiduously learning all enemy ships and giving regular tests to each aircrew member of the flight, Whiteley included. It's quite possible that Warby would have remained a navigator, had it not been for 2 of the pilots succumbing to a particularly unpleasant form of dysentery known as Malta dog. By the 26th of September, Warby's total flying time on twin-engine planes was a negligible 35 minutes. But with the reconnaissance flight in great demand already, Whiteley had little choice but to hand him one of the Marylands. One of Warby's greatest problems was the poor quality of his takeoffs and landings, something that had hindered his flying career to date. In the operational record book of 431 flight, Warby's first flight, a supposed reconnaissance trip to Corfu, was abandoned owing to hydraulic failure and aircraft crashed on landing. This rather euphemistically hides the fact that he'd zigzagged the plane so roughly across the airfield on takeoff that a wheel had come off. It must have been a terrifying experience for the two other crew members, who faced enough danger as it was without the added risk of death by incompetent flying. With one of his Marylands now out of action, Whiteley must have been tempted to take Warby off flying once and for all, but a shortage of pilots and a gut feeling that his oddball junior officer would still come good ensured another reprieve. It will be Warby's last chance to prove himself as a pilot. On his second flight, Warby had not only managed to take to the air safely, but had also landed without mishap. Titch Whiteley had breathed a sigh of relief, and from then on began to use him as a pilot on a more regular basis. On the 9th of October, though, Warby flew as Whiteley's navigator and stunned his commanding officer by picking out all of the Italian ships in Taranto, which were later confirmed by the photographs that he'd taken. For this work they received considerable praise. The following day Warby flew himself and again managed to take some excellent pictures of the entire Italian fleet lying at anchor. The other members of the reconnaissance flight were beginning to take note of his exceptional eyesight and ability to pick out and accurately identify the Italian ships. His reputation as a pilot was growing as well. His takeoffs and landings were still painful to watch, but in the air he demonstrated a lightness of touch that surprised his crews. On the 30th of October, with just 12 days to go until the planned attack on Taranto, the weather was poor, but undeterred, Warby set off in one of the Marylands to photograph the Italian harbour once again. Because of the cloud cover, he was forced to fly in low and take oblique photographs instead of the normal high overhead shots. Unsurprisingly, they flew into considerable anti-aircraft fire. Despite this, Warby took his pictures and managed to escape. On the return trip, they ran into an Italian seaplane. Although reconnaissance planes weren't fighters, and were armed only for self-defence, and despite never having had any gunnery training, Warby opened fire and shot the plane into the sea. A few days later, the weather was still poor, as gloomy and grey as anything back home in England, nor was there any sign of it clearing between Malta and Taranto. None of the other reconnaissance crews were flying to the Italian naval base in such weather, but Warby was undaunted. "We're going at 0 feet the whole way," he told his two crew, Sergeants Johnny Spires and Paddy Moran. "Get yourself a sharp pencil and plenty of paper. If we can't photograph the ships, you'll have to plot them on the harbour map," he said to Spires while instructing Moran to read out loud across the intercom the names on the sides of the ships. Just think about that for a moment. He was planning to get so low and so close that you'd be able to read the names on the sides of the ships. As Taranto emerged, they saw that the normal barrage balloons had been lowered. The weather had clamped down so much the Italians weren't expecting visitors. Catching the enemy completely unawares, they circled twice around the harbour, calling out the names of the ships with the camera clicking. Suddenly the harbour's anti-aircraft defences woke up and unleashed a hailstorm of tracer, flak and machine gun fire. Warby flew the plane as low as he could and skimmed out of the way. Only there was an anomaly. Safely out of reach, they began to compare notes and realised that their observations didn't compare with the previous day's reconnaissance. They counted out 6 battleships when there should have only been 5. Warby's reaction was instant. "We'll go in again," he told the other two, and ordered them to count off the battleships out loud together. Turning back into the anti-aircraft fire, Warby took them so low the wingtips were almost skimming the surface of the sea. Although they avoided the worst of the anti-aircraft fire, there was still plenty of orange tracer flashes shooting around them. Spires wondered how they could ever escape alive. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, they counted out loud as the Maryland weaved between the anchored ships. They were still only 5. They'd mistaken a cruiser for a battleship. Miraculously, they got away. But by this time, they were being pursued by 4 Italian planes, 3 fighter biplanes and a seaplane. Moran fired off most of his ammunition, shooting down their second seaplane and damaging one of the fighters. This was enough to deter the Italians, who broke off the attack. 4 hours after they'd taken off, they touched back down at Lucca. It was only then that they discovered part of an aerial from one of the Italian ships was caught in their tail wheel. They'd flown so low, they'd actually flown into one of the Italian battleships. In the build-up to the attack on Taranto, Warby was flying over the Italian naval base almost every day. On the 7th, he was again pursued by enemy fighters on his return to Malta. This time they were 4 Marchi 200s. Although they were both faster and more manoeuvrable than the Maryland, Warby had discovered that lowering a wing flap, normally used when landing, slowed the speed and turn of the aircraft to such an extent that the Marchis overshot him. In an unusually long-running battle, Warby managed to shoot down his 3rd enemy plane, before once again escaping unscathed. 3 days later, he photographed 5 battleships, 14 cruisers and 27 destroyers lying in Taranto harbour. By the following day, a 6th battleship had arrived, which he was able to photograph and confirm on the afternoon of the 11th, the final reconnaissance before the attack. On the day of the actual attack on Taranto itself, many of the strike aircraft had reported hits, but because they hadn't hung around to observe their handiwork, it was left a 431 reconnaissance flight the following day. It was an anxious few hours for all involved, not least Admiral Cunningham, who, pacing about an HMS Warspite, spent the night and the next morning on tenterhooks. Titch Whiteley, who flew over Taranto in the morning, was able to report considerable damage, and the photographs once developed confirmed what he'd seen. 3 battleships sunk or damaged, and a cruiser and 2 destroyers damaged. Half the Italian battle fleet had been put out of action. Within days, the remainder of the fleet moved out of Taranto and further north to Naples. The strike had been a crushing blow for the Italians. Warby's contribution to the success had been considerable. In just 2 months, he'd been transformed from a washed-up, good-for-nothing misfit into one of the most daring, reliable, and indefatigable members of Whiteley's team. Something, somewhere, had clicked for Adrian Warburton. For his work over Taranto, he was awarded a Distinguished Flying Cross. His moment to shine had finally arrived. I guess all of which just goes to show that it doesn't matter how big a wanker you are, eventually you're going to be good for something. And on that bombshell, that's it for this week's episode of Mingles with Jingles. That was all from James Holland's amazing book, Fortress Malta, which I highly recommend to all of you. And no, this isn't a sponsored video. It's just a good book, and it deserves to be read. In the meantime, of course, as always, take care, stay safe. I hope you all have a good week, and I'll catch you next time.